Good afternoon again, and thank you again for joining the transport session, the transport stage. This is our final session, so thank you very much for those of you who've been with us throughout the day. We've had some really good panel sessions, we've had some great speakers, and to top it off, have we saved the best till last? I think we probably have. So a really exciting panel session. This one's focused on road transport. Road transport, the carbon in road transport, the carbon emitted by road transport has remained stubbornly high over the last number of years, despite lots of innovation. But we've actually heard throughout the day a couple of different stats. I'm not quite sure now. 1 in 3, 1 in 6 new cars being battery electric or having a plug, somewhere in that range at least. So we're seeing the emergence of battery electric vehicles on the road. We've also seen the importance of HGVs and the potential decarbonisation of those and the route going forward. So are we about to see the carbon start to tumble from our roads? That's what this panel is all about. We've got our moderator, Max Sugarman, Chief Executive of the Intelligent Transport Systems UK, and his panel. So thank you, Max.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I'm really excited. This is the last session of the day, but in some ways I think is possibly the most important session because obviously, I'm sure everyone said that, but obviously transport is a huge carbon emitter, one of the highest, and road transport within that is about half in 2020 of all GHG emissions from transport as a whole. So we really need to tackle this and get emissions down, get to net zero. And we have a fantastic panel today who are going to take us through what we're doing in the industry to get emissions down and provide you with some food for thought and try and develop some thinking about how we solve this issue. So without much further ado, I'll introduce my panel. It's worth saying that we really want audience interaction during this session. So we have a Slido. I think the Slido should be up on the. I don't know whether it is, but I think you can capture it on the QR code. So do submit your questions. Let us know your thoughts. We're really interested to hear about what you think on this issue. So, starting on my far left, we have Adam Simmons, Director for Strategic Planning and Analysis at National Highways. Adam was previously Director of Future RIS and Government Relations, and before that was at the Department for Transport for 7 years as Deputy Director for HS2, Phase 2A. He's also been a team leader for the Managed Motorways Programme and has a PhD in Ecology and Evolution from the University of Leeds. We then have Kate Jennings, who is Policy Director at Logistics UK, and she was appointed in June 2022. And Kate started her career in the civil service, first in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, including a posting in Beijing, and then worked in the Department for Transport from 1990 to 2020, leading on EU and international transport policy. From 2020 to June 2022, Kate was Policy Director at the Railway Industry Association, leading on coronavirus response, strategic engagement and diversity, including the launch of the Women in Rail Diversity and Inclusion Charter. And I think there's a common trend here, which is dipping between rail and road, which I think seems to be a bit of a theme. And last but not least, we have Christophe Nicodeme. Christophe graduated in translation and after an intensive training in sales and marketing. He started his career working as sales manager for companies specialising in the road infrastructure sector, more particular for road markings, road maintenance and road safety systems. He counts with an international experience in implementing and assessing traffic calming schemes in urban areas and on major road networks in Europe and Latin America. And in 2008, he was appointed Director General of the European Union Road Federation, which he's representing today, a non-profit organisation representing the European road infrastructure sector and acting as a platform of dialogue and research for road mobility issues. So we've got a really good perspective across logistics, international, and as a transport operator as well. So I'm going to ask each of you to give us your thoughts on the topic of how we decarbonise road transport for 5 minutes or so, and then we'll get into some questions and thoughts. So Christophe, if I can go first with you, how do we decarbonise road transport?
Thank you very much, Max. It's a pleasure to be here, and more particularly for the European Union Road Federation, as the things have changed a little bit in the last years because UK used to be a member of the European Union, which is no more the case. So we keep on having very good relationship with some of our members who are based in the UK, but we can see also the way things evolve differently from the European Union perspective and the UK perspective. And what I think is interesting, and I'm very grateful to you for having this session focusing on the infrastructure. Because when we talk about mobility and road transport, I think that in most of the cases people think vehicles, cars, trucks, all the users of the infrastructure. And we represent the infrastructure, which is really the hardware on which the whole traffic, the whole mobility takes place. And it's very often not taken enough into consideration. There are great efforts that are made for improving the carbon footprint of the vehicles with electric vehicles, hydrogen, some new solutions. Also, there are some very ambitious plans at the European level, European Commission, for decarbonising the vehicles with the ban of selling fossil fuels vehicles after 2035, the objective of the Green Deal, the Fit for 55. There are a lot of ambitious objectives, and very often people just look at the vehicles and don't consider the infrastructure. It is sure that most of the emissions come from the vehicles, but we also have a role to play as the provider of the road infrastructure in order to also contribute to the reduction of the global emissions. And there are a lot of efforts that are made by the road infrastructure sector. And I think it is necessary to let this known by the public, because it's too often forgotten. And we have a large potential of contributing to the reduction of the emissions for road transport and mobility.
Fantastic. Thanks, Christophe. I think that's a really important element, and we'll look at that in a bit. But Kate, if you want to just give your 5 minutes.
Yes, indeed. And I thought I would talk first about a little bit more about Logistics UK and who we are, and about innovation, and then about carbon. So it's great to be here, and thank Max for inviting me. And as he said, it's the last session of the day, but it seems pretty packed, so that's really good. Logistics UK is the only trade association which represents the whole of logistics in the UK. So our members are road and rail operators, infrastructure owners, so that could be warehouses, ports, airports, and then the buyers of logistics services and some of the suppliers to logistics. So buyers include people like Nestle or supermarkets. Suppliers could be the vehicle manufacturers. So we have quite a diverse membership covering the whole spectrum of what logistics does. We have about 20,000 members, so it's a great privilege to represent them. The industry is obviously global, European, international, but very much sort of national and local. I think everybody uses logistics for everything every day, whether it's building High Speed 2 or whether it's going to the supermarket and picking things up on the shelves. Somebody's got them there, and it's our industry that does that. In the UK, over 2.7 million people are directly employed in logistics, which is 8.5% of all jobs in the UK. And in terms of the direct contribution to the economy, that's 12% of GVA. I think because we're quite a diverse sector, people don't always realise how many jobs there are and how much economic value the sector brings. And I would argue that logistics is also one of the most innovative sectors in any country. If you think about things like response to crisis, COVID, leaving the EU, Ukraine, and how the logistics industry responds to that to make sure that you've got, the food in the supermarkets or the hospitals, vaccines. We are essential, critical infrastructure. But we also innovate, so where is robotics, AI, data, supply chain mapping and modeling, where is that all happening? It's happening in logistics. So we have a strong trend and tradition of innovating effectively. If you think of something like the shipping container, something like that, which absolutely transformed logistics, and it is multimodal. It goes from sea to road to rail. It could probably be a bit more interoperable on the rail side, but it's pretty good, isn't it? So my starting pitch is, we're good at innovating. And actually, zero carbon ambition and the goals that have been set by government in the UK and globally have created this massive opportunity to innovate. And I think we're ready for it, and you see it happening around you, which is amazing. To innovate effectively, I think that we need three things. We need to sort of do what I've just done, raise the profile of logistics as a sector which is innovative, celebrate that, think about what it means for all of us. We would like then active support for innovation. So logistics is very much a private sector. There's a lot of private money going into innovation, but we can't do this on our own. Christophe was talking about infrastructure. It's not just the transport infrastructure that we need. It's not just the roads and the rail, which are all publicly funded. But energy, we need the energy in the right places, and we need to know what that energy is so that logistics, the private investment can flow and the vehicle manufacturers can give us the right vehicles, etc. And then finally, so first thing, profile, second, active support, and then the third thing really is leadership, because this is a huge opportunity, isn't it, for the UK and the industry to be creative and competitive and productive. And if you think of a specific example there, sustainable aviation fuels, we're pleased that the government is looking at how we can support a UK industry to supply sustainable aviation fuels. But we expect those companies not just to supply aviation, I think they will also supply HGVs because we will need those fuels. Even when you've got hydrogen trucks and electric vehicles on the roads, for a long time we will still have diesel fleets, traditional engines, and we will need the fuels to support them. And if you use low carbon fuels, you can save carbon today. You don't have to wait 10 years to work out what your hydrogen plan is or something. You can do it now. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Kate. No, really, that's really interesting, and three clear things that we can also have a little think about in the discussion. So last but not least, Adam, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on National Highways work on this topic.
Yeah, thank you, Max. Good afternoon, everyone. So at National Highways, we are a government company with responsibility for operating, maintaining and improving England's motorways and major A roads. So it's actually a comparatively small network by distance, but carries some really important traffic, 2/3 of all traffic and 1/3 of all freight. So I wanted to talk about sort of three things, but I suppose what I would sort of say up front is I think my overall theme about decarbonising road transport is to borrow from the sort of popular TV advert, every little helps. There is no one big silver bullet. I think it is about making lots of small improvements, and hopefully I can illustrate that a little bit this afternoon. First thing I wanted to say is I think it's really important that we recognise that roads are important. I think we've heard from Kate and Christophe about that, but roads carry 9 times the freight that rail does. If you think about our own network, England's motorways and major A roads, industries that are dependent on that, so logistics industries, construction, manufacturing, they contribute £410 billion in gross value added to the economy. So I think it just illustrates how important that, perhaps even if as individuals we're not using these roads, our daily lives absolutely depend on it. So I do think that it is not credible to uninvest or de-invest in roads. Obviously, we've got to decarbonise. What I would say is that we are thinking about investment in the strategic roads for the next 5 years, or from 2025 onwards. Last week we published some documents, and government is running a consultation on this. So it's a very live discussion now about how to invest in our strategic roads and where. And what we would argue is actually that there is still a place for investing in improving roads. Really, we need to improve the safety of our roads, and actually things like smaller junction improvements can be really important in those last mile journeys to get goods to where they need to get to. The second point I'd make is that as a government company, we are getting our house in order. So we've set ourselves 2 targets about our direct emissions. So our very immediate carbon emissions as a company, we're aiming to be net zero by 2030. So those corporate emissions, since 2020, we've already reduced those by 2/3. So we've transitioned already 2/3 of all our vehicles that we use over to ultra low emission vehicles. We've converted 1/3 of our lighting to LEDs, as a couple of examples. In terms of our construction and maintenance, that's very much how we deliver through our supply chain. We're committing to net zero by 2040. Since 2020, we reduced that carbon by 1/3, so making good progress there. And actually, again, it's about starting with the basics. I think we're the first company globally, roads authority company globally to be PAS 2080 accredited, so applying those principles to how we do business. And we are starting to invest and trial in low carbon materials. So on the M42 near Birmingham, we're trialing 4 types of low carbon concrete in our schemes. We're looking to see, obviously, can they deliver the low carbon output, but can they perform in the investment that we need? So thirdly, all the things I've spoken about, in terms of all the emissions to do with the strategic road network, I've covered 2% of the emissions. 98% of the emissions, of course, come from the tailpipe of the cars and trucks that are using our roads today. Government, I think, has set some really good ambitious plans in its transport decarbonisation plan to transition to low-emitting and zero-emitting vehicles. And you might think that as almost a construction operations company, is there much we can do to help with that? And again, actually, I think there's a lot we can do to encourage that transition. So we've trained all of our traffic officers who respond to incidents to deal with breakdowns for electric vehicles. We have to deal with them in a different way to an internal combustion engine vehicle. Kate talked about the energy for particularly electric charging vehicles. We've invested, I think in the last 2 years, £20 million just to put some, these are more temporary solutions, but to put some energy storage devices in motorway service areas, so they've got the energy sort of throughput available to power their electric charging. And you might have heard of government's Project Rapid investment. It's a £1 billion investment to put 6 high-speed rapid charging chargers at every motorway service area. National Highways is the delivery partner to take that forward, and that's very much about getting those connections from the national grid through the local DNOs to motorway service areas to make sure we can provide that. Kate talked about innovation, and really important to us, we're supporting government's trials for HGVs, low emission HGVs, things like platooning of HGVs on the network. And actually, there are always going to be some bumps in the road. There's great potential for platooning. We probably earlier identified that maybe the strategic road network as it isn't perfect for that. There are still junctions and things like that just are not great for platooning. So we're starting to learn those lessons. We're having the evidence and the data to think about how we can do that. And we're starting to think about how we support things like autonomous vehicles. Again, if we get that right, we can get vehicles closer together, can maximize the use of our assets there. There's less of a need to add capacity to our network. And actually, some of the emerging data that we've got suggests that maybe only a small uptake of autonomous technologies can really make a big difference in maximizing the capacity. So I think what I'd conclude is, we're really taking this seriously. It's important that we recognize that road transport really does matter, so we do need to find a way to decarbonize it. And like I say, I think kind of that attitude of making small improvements but across the board is the secret to making progress here.
Great, thank you very much. So there's lots of stuff to get into there across all 3 of your talks. I think I want to start with going back to what Christoph was saying about road infrastructure, and particularly, road infrastructure has become politicised more. We're seeing different approaches across devolved administrations. Famously in Wales, they are now they've done this review which is saying, do we need to build more roads? I wonder what your thoughts are on the future of road infrastructure. Are we going to see the end of large road funding schemes? Are we going to be moving to other funding for different things? I don't know who wants to tackle that first.
Shall I?
Okay, yes, maybe.
So like I say, we put out it's a document called our Strategic Road Network Initial Report, if you want to look it up online. And it's something that government, Department of Transport, is consulting on. So very much a live question. I think I'd say a few things. First, actually, even in the previous road investment period, half of our investment was around operating, maintaining, renewing the assets as they already exist. So that requires investment. I think we absolutely recognise that the assets that are there need to be kept in good order. We need to make sure we're avoiding emergency works that can be very, very disruptive, particularly to Kate's sort of members. So we've got to keep the asset performing as it is. I think the second thing I'd say is that I think there absolutely is a place for improving and enhancing the network. I think kind of at one level, I mentioned in my presentation, safety schemes. If we have a license requirement to improve safety on our roads, you can't improve safety by just maintaining things as you are. There are some areas where we want to invest to tackle those lower performing roads out. That if you're familiar with the IRAP rating system, we want to focus on the 1- and 2-star rated roads on our network. And actually, these are investments that have super high benefit cost ratios, value for money assessments, so they're a good bet. Similarly, in smaller investments to improve things like junctions, that's what causes a lot of congestion, particularly for local journeys. So whether your objectives are, really that last mile, getting goods to where they need to get to, improving journeys for things like levelling up, that's a big investment there. I would say as well, there is place for a really big investment. We're saying we should take forward something like the Lower Thames Crossing to alleviate pressure and the routes from the whole country, particularly to those southwest ports. That's our connection to Europe, those international gateways. The current crossings at Dartford are already under pressure. They're only going to be more. So building that extra capacity and more choice, I think there's absolutely a case for that investment too. What I would say is we've got to then do it in a low carbon, zero carbon way.
Christoph, if I come to you next, so what's the view of the European Union on this, and what do you think is the kind of what's Europe going in terms of their direction?
Right. It is true that at the European level, people are conscious of the fact that road is really one of the major carrier of traffic and mobility. We publish every year some road statistics, European road statistics, and what we see is that the percentage of inland transport for passengers and for freight remains approximately the same. So we are talking about something like 78 to 82%. And from one year to the following, we hardly see a difference. And in the vision, even of the European Commission, they are aware that these percentages are going to be maintained at such a level. What we noticed is that there is a lot of ambition at the European level, at the level of the European Commission. But when we look at each country separately, there's a little bit of an issue when, as producer or supplier or applicator of systems, we have to try to push new approach in our relationships with the road authorities. We have this sort of habit. Let's do business as usual. We know the systems, we know how they work, we are generally satisfied with the way the materials or the services provided. So why should we take the risk of going for something different, something more technological, something more innovative? Why should I take the risk? If there's an issue, if there's a problem, I could be blamed for that. So there's also a question of investment, because as I said, the road infrastructure sector, the producer, the applicators, we are developing a lot of new technologies to reduce our carbon footprint by using new supply sources, new materials, recycling, reuse, make the road infrastructure more resilient. And this is also quite an important element if we look at the way the climate is evolving everywhere. But we are very often facing the issue of, that's a little bit too expensive, and let's maybe give it a try, but not very daring type of attitude. And it is quite important that we see the road infrastructure as a global provider of mobility, especially with the new type of traffic that we are going to see, the new requirements at the European level in terms of emissions. I give you an example. During the lockdown, which is the transport mode and the transport infrastructure which has very quickly been able to modify some schemes, more particularly in urban areas, from almost one day to the other, providing a cycle lane where there was only a road, adapting to new usage requirements by the citizens. It is the road infrastructure. So we can be more flexible. We can adapt more easily to changes. And the changes that are in front of us for logistics and for other purposes are quite huge. So we have to prove that we are able to provide this new service, provided, of course, we are given the opportunity to apply them on the road network. And it's quite interesting to hear about your vision of huge investments for making the road infrastructure more adapted to the future and reducing drastically the impact on the environment. And that's something that we really welcome. We would like to see that happening more often in different countries, but hopefully with the support of the European Commission and the vision that they want to apply in the European Union, it might be also a help for our sector.
Fantastic. I think also you touched on the point that actually roads aren't just for cars, and I think actually we have a tendency to focus on the automotive sector, but actually, you know, the transition to bike lanes for COVID, as you mentioned.
More and more, I think the urban and interurban environment for the role of road is taking more importance. There's a lot of mobility which really uses your urban area, and the urban mobility becomes a priority in many of the mobility schemes in Europe.
So I'm going to pick up on questions. So if you've got any questions, do send them in. We do have quite a few. But Kate, very quickly, I do want to ask you whether your members are thinking about that, because you, of course, cover both road, rail, and increasingly, I'm sure, micro logistics as well, which is becoming a big. So, you know, are your members moving more into that to make sure they reduce their carbon emissions?
Yeah, so maybe start with your initial question of, do we still need roads investment? You know, absolutely we do. You know, like, is it 80%, 90%? You know, most of the capacity is road capacity. Every freight journey starts and ends with road, pretty much. And, you know, I always say, you know, freight isn't just there for fun, is it? You know, it's there because it is delivering something useful to somebody, or you know, whether it's a company or a you know, hospital, or whether it's an individual. And we do talk to, you know, say the Welsh Government. You know, obviously we talk to them about their road strategy. And we were quite pleased that they recognise in that the need for freight. You know, are members thinking about multimodal? Yes, absolutely they are. What we stand for is optimising the national freight network. We very much support the government's commitment to a national freight network. And that means, you know, getting that interoperability absolutely right, and prioritising, you know, the logistics system, because it is a system. And it's quite interesting when you take an example like Wales and you look at it from a logistics perspective, and you sort of go, well, what's going where? You know, things are going through Wales into Northern Ireland out of Holyhead. You've got steel, Tata Steel, you've got a Freeport, you've got Airbus, you've got car manufacturers, you've got rolling stock manufacturers, and you've got limited capacity on rail. So, you know, when we look at it, you know, at that regional level or the national level, it's the same thing. It's like, what are the trade-offs? You know, do you want more passengers on rail and more freight, you know, to free up the freight on the motorways, because the motorways are congested? You know, and I think we have to do that in order to get to zero carbon, and in order to maximise or optimise the efficiency of the logistics system. You actually have to slightly go down a level and go, you know, why do we need it? Who's going where? Where do we want, you know, people on bikes? You talked about risk. I thought it was a really interesting question. At the moment, members are making big strategic decisions about where they invest private money. And I think, back to my partnership point, this is not just about the public funding of the road network. It's about my members not wasting their money on the wrong technology. So LNG is a good example where, local authorities and private companies invested in technology, and they're not always using those hybrid trucks because they haven't got the LNG in the right places and they haven't got the certainty that fuel will be there. When they're looking at electric vehicles, for example, we've just done our second of our reports on electric vehicles. I think there were two new things. There were points, the things that Christopher said about, the need to make sure the charge points are there, the need to make sure you've got the infrastructure as well as the vehicles, obviously very important. But two other things I thought were really, really interesting. The members who are using electric vehicles have realised that they have to change their business model. You can't just do like for like. And maybe a refrigerated vehicle is the most obvious example of this. We have a member who delivers drugs to people's homes. So that could be, because you've got cancer, it might be, some emergency supply to real people who are totally dependent on that. And he was saying to me recently, what they realise, they're a national company, they will need twice as many vans, twice as many drivers, twice as many regional centres. Don't underestimate the cost to private sector businesses from transition. And this is why the private sector needs, the government to be funding in charge points and creating certainty, or funding in things like the ZERF trials for hydrogen and electric vehicles, because you've got private money at risk, and we can do it faster with help. If we have a national network, if we have sort of co-funding of some of these really exciting projects.
Thanks, Kate. Right, there's a lot of questions, so we're going to try and take 3 at a time. We're going to try and see how many we can get through in the time that we have. So first up, Noel Dolphin. E-highway trials with overhead electrification for road freight have happened in Germany and Sweden. Do the panellists foresee such a trial happening in the UK? So keep that in mind, but I'll give you 2 more as well. Another easy one. Is road user charging a silver bullet for road decarbonisation? And then finally, demand management, especially for private vehicles such as roadway charging, are key. Sorry, that's kind of covered by the other one that we've just talked about road user charging. So final one, train is more efficient mode of transport. Why is there all the fuss about the electric car and road infrastructure instead of making train affordable? So a bit off the road topic, but a fair point that we are up against the rail industry as well in other sectors. So have to think about that as well. So if I give you those, so e-highways, road pricing, and competing with rail. Who wants to go first with those? Adam, should we come back to you?
Why not? Shall I try a rapid fire on each? So you talked about the sort of e-roads, the kind of things like the catenary systems, kind of overhead wires and so on. There are some trials happening in Europe. Our chief engineer, Mike Wilson, is actually quite well plugged into those. Sorry, forgive the pun, unintended. I'll give a personal view. I'm not entirely sure that is necessarily something I can see as a longer-term sort of solution. I know there's sort of talks about maybe some of these sort of overhead cables being more of a top-up to vehicles. I think Siemens are investing in that sort of technology. That's the point of a trial. Let's look to see how it's working. But I think there's some good stuff that's happening across Europe, and we're watching. I don't think there are any plans at the moment in the UK to have those trials. Road user charging. Let me give you the government view at the moment. Treasury's been very clear that government is not going to go down a road pricing sort of route, although I know the Transport Select Committee did say it felt that perhaps it was inevitable. There will be a change in motoring taxation. I think from a National Highways perspective, actually it is possible to look at that sort of thing in quite a neutral and objective way. I think it is quite likely that there will be some sort of change in how we are taxed, or how motoring is taxed. And I think from our perspective, we want to do is sort of look to see what sort of transport benefits can be achieved from that. So if there is a different way of paying, one could absolutely prioritise so that you charge trucks and things less to prioritise them. I think there's that sort of that scope for it. I think what I would say is that certainly our priority is to give choice and not sort of force a particular direction. I think that's where government is. The question of train sort of more efficient. I think there's sort of two things to my mind. I think one, if you look at the trajectories that Department for Transport have put in terms of decarbonising road, I think by about the mid-2030s, the sort of per passenger carbon of certainly cars, trucks is a little bit later, will sort of equal where rail is. So actually it is decarbonising fast, it's that sort of pace. And actually the sort of investment decisions we're taking now are about things sort of providing in that kind of time frame. So we do have to think about that. I'd also say one of affordability. Before COVID sort of happened, I think if you sort of equalise for per passenger mile, for every £1 that was spent on per passenger mile for road, I think it was about £15 for rail. Over COVID, of course, footfalls fallen, fares have dropped. I think public investment now in rail is up to about £28 per that passenger. Sorry, 28 times than it is for roads. So it's a very expensive bet. I think you do have to do both, but I don't think it's a case of just throwing it into rail and not road.
Great. Kate,
Should I go
come to you
next? So, yeah, 3 questions. Catenary, I suppose my challenge would be, like, can we afford not to? Because I think, as Adam said, you know, it may be that it's not like a whole motorway that you've got an overhead wire. It's more, you know, you're topping up your batteries. And if we've got vehicles coming in from Europe, if we've got all the manufacturers, you know, being not UK companies, you know, do we need to, you know, have the technology that the vehicles can use, or have drivers coming in from Europe and needing to be able to charge here, you know? So that would be my thought on catenary. On road and rail, if I take that next, you know, again, it's about optimizing the system. I think rail is very good for longer distances. Our position on things like rail freight growth targets is, you know, yes, please, but not at any price. Rail needs to be competitive with road. You know, we need to be commercial realists sort of here. And I think there's more to be done in terms of, you know, interoperability between rail and road, you know, that container sort of question. Also, you know, brokerage, you know, having smaller, you know, not having to fill a whole, you know, trains are great because you've got, is it 126 HGV vehicles on one train? But that's a lot of stuff, isn't it? You know, so how do you break that down into things that people actually want to make those journeys? And I think what's fun is I am absolutely seeing my members taking rail more seriously than I think they have done previously. You know, we've got big members. You know, carbon accounting is really, really interesting here. People are starting to use carbon accounting, and they're starting to say, shall I spend my money shifting to rail, and you know that will cost me because I'll have to redesign my business, I'll have to invest in some stuff and change the relationships, or shall I invest my money in e-vehicles or hydrogen? You know, that is becoming a strategic choice, and it's quite nice to sort of see that happening. And then road pricing. And I'll say what we say to the Treasury. We say to the Treasury, look, you know that fuel duty is going to, you know, if we meet our targets, there will be no fuel duty. So talk to us, you know, tell us. And our strapline for this is that we want to see a fair transition. And what we mean by fair transition, you know, from an industry perspective, is you can't use logistics as a cash cow. And I think sometimes, I would argue, you know, when you think about city clean air zones and things, sometimes people, I don't think they realize what they're doing. They try to tax the industry when the technology isn't there, or they're not actually the main cause of the air quality or the congestion problem. So I think, you know, we would like an honest conversation about road pricing.
Fair enough. Yeah. Well, I think following the Transport Select Committee, it's not an issue that's going to go away, unfortunately. No. Right, Christoph, what's your view on our three big topics?
I will probably focus more on the two first items, which is the catenary system, for example. I think that we are still looking at different possibilities and different solutions, and there won't be one solution fit for all. So what we need to try is to see in which case do we have advantages of using catenary system. It's certainly not all along the whole network. It would cost, the cost would be absolutely ludicrous to get that sort of thing. In some cases, the induction system might be a solution. Hydrogen is another solution. We won't have one solution fits for all, I think, and depending on the characteristics, the particularities of an area, of a requirement or a necessity, we could give the preference to one type of system instead of another one. But again, there's a question of cost and investment. Is the investment is that investment really the right one for what we need? Talking about road user charging, we have, for many years, we have advocated for a road user charging scheme which is fair. In fact, our main concern was that when particularly the European Commission was talking about road user charging, they were looking at different types of externalities. They wanted to include into that so many externalities, and some of them were not really externalities, but some problems that the users had to suffer, and they were not creating those issues, so it was unfair. And what we did not want, and we really repeated that very often, we did not want the road user charging to be another layer of tax, because a tax, you take the money and you can use it for anything. Road user charging, the mobility, the movement, the transport, it has a cost. Using the infrastructure has a cost. But the charging scheme must be fair, proportionate, and another important thing, we need to have a real earmarking of that money, because the main concern for us was that that money would have been taken from the road users, but for which type of purpose? And originally, I'm sorry to say that because it was sort of typical war, the Commission was thinking, we are going to take the money from the road users and we are going to give that money to the rail, which was totally unfair in the sense that we were, as you said, the cash cows, once again, and we were seeing that the trend was to take the money from a sector which is already heavily taxed, to give it to another mode of transport, more by, let's say, with a sort of philosophy of it's better, it's greener, so let's give the money to them, and let's take it from the bad ones to give it to the good ones. It's a bit caricatural, but that was a sort of principle that we could see in the European institutions. It has changed a little bit.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. So I think we've got time for just about 3 more questions. So I'm going to really try and fit as many in as we can. First of all, Stefan from Stealth Startup, who asks, how is data gathered from infrastructure going to impact city planning? How is the UK/EU preparing for autonomous cars? So that's I suppose that's 2 questions in one, but we can put that as kind of data and connectivity. Number 2 is the confidence. Do you have confidence that UK politicians will support the transport sector's investment plans? What interventions would you like to see from our politicians? And finally, what's your thoughts of getting vehicles out of road and providing mass transport, especially in the countryside like the southwest? And I think that's a really interesting final point around rural mobility, which doesn't often get talked about in some ways as much as urban. So that's impact of data and autonomy, confidence from politicians, and rural mobility. Another 3 very light issues. If I go along the other way, so Christoph, if you want to start on those.
Yeah, data. We are here talking about the aspect of digitalization, for example, and it certainly can contribute to reduce the impact of the road transport. I think that there are very high benefits to get from the digitalizations and data, the processing of all data, but it is not going to be the solution. I think getting digitalized won't be the solution to all the issues. It's a combination of different ones that we need to incorporate into our vision and operation of the road infrastructure. The confidence in the politicians, we often say that we are facing a sort of contradictory situation in the sense that the life cycle of a road is 30, 40, 50 years, even more, if we have a vision of preserving, maintaining, and regular maintenance and upgrade of the infrastructure. The vision of the politicians is the next term. So you have a big difference between 5 years and 50 years. So it's sometimes a little bit difficult to bring those together, but there are some politicians who have a vision. And I think that we see more interest to the preservation and the improvement of the quality and the service of the road infrastructure. And last point about rural areas, it is sure that it mainly depends from one country to the other. If I take the example of Belgium, we have a very dense population. So it is totally different than a country like France, where you have a lot of areas where the only way to get mobility is to use the road for the people. And I don't even talk about freight transport. This is even something different and maybe a larger sort of view, but for the people to be able to go to bring the children to school, to go to their work, to go to the hospital, to go to and get service from the public authorities, they need the car because there's no really public transport. Most of these small train lines have been closed. So really, it's you have to take into consideration the local situation and characteristics, and again, it depends from one country to the other.
Thanks, Christophe. No one size fits all, I think. Kate, do you want to go next?
Yes. So data and then politics. So on data, clearly data is critical to logistics and increasingly available, isn't it? So I think there will be huge opportunities to use data to make sure that logistics is productive. And the more efficient you are, typically the lower carbon you are. In the short term, I think we need to sort of invest to save, don't we? We need to take risks on new technologies and implement them and make sure they're effective and learn the lessons. But in the end, it should be win-win, shouldn't it? If we collect the data and we look at it, it should be. And if I sort of caricature, so to make my point really, at the moment I would argue that a lot of cities are not optimized for freight. They have HGVs can only go on certain roads, which tend to be a bit longer than maybe the optimum journey. The charge points are maybe not in the right places. The warehouses and consolidation centres are not in the right places. The rules on things like curbside parking. If you use your data to optimize, then you would save carbon. And, when you look at global supply chains and global risks, I have seen technologies that can track back that actually that chip all comes from the same factory in Taiwan or, data is fascinating and intelligent use of data will make our industry better and help us innovate and deliver zero carbon. Politics, I agree with Christophe, it's that sort of short-term versus long-term challenge, isn't it? We're at a really interesting moment in the political cycle. Thinking about what the current government's views are on zero carbon and innovation and logistics and road. Also looking at what Labour and, the Liberal Democrats and others are thinking. Clearly we've also got the devolved governments and their points of view. And I would come back to what I said at the beginning, actually, as a representing the sort of transport and logistics sector, we need to be creating that strategic vision about why it's important to recognise, investment in zero carbon transport is good for everybody. It's good for saving the planet and getting to those targets. It's good for jobs all over the country. It's good for innovation and creativity. And because otherwise the risk is that things will be delayed. And I'll give a really tangible example of that. the ZERF trials. You know, we're very, very excited that the UK is investing in hydrogen and electric HGV trials in the UK. But the announcement was supposed to be before Christmas. We know there are consortia. We know that some people know they haven't won, and we know that some people know they have won. And they're all getting very frustrated that it's not yet public, and they can't just get on with it. And if you are a truck manufacturer, for example, you can't sell any trucks at the moment because people don't know who's won. And if you're making a choice about whether to put your trucks in Europe or to bring them to the UK, at the margin, you know, that's just slowing us down. So I would, you know, we just need to keep helping politicians understand how they can help, and how they sometimes don't even realise how they're slowing things down or making things cost more. And then your last question, rural areas.
Yes, rural areas.
I nearly forgot then. So rural areas, really, really important to think how you get, you know, freight to the rural areas. I mean, again, it helps to look at maps, doesn't it? If you look at a national grid and where the energy is, you will see things like the fact that a lot of rural areas, you know, don't have that much access to the grid. And I think that will help you think about, you know, whether you need to do what national highways are doing and, you know, put in energy storage solutions, you know, batteries, or think about how you deploy your hydrogen, or and it also affects things like e-scooters and you know, bikes and things. We had interesting conversations with stakeholders about saying, you know, can we have a consolidation centre on the edge of a villages or something, and then could you have bikes, or I don't know, but let's talk about it, you know, because we need to get mobility right for the villagers, for freight as well as for people.
Fantastic, thanks, Kate. And Adam, if we give you the final word.
Well, thank you. I mean, on data, I think already recognise it's really important that we give accurate data to our customers, you know, like Kate, so, you know, people can plan their journeys, know where roadworks are, things like that. I think building on that, where we want to invest more to support digital and autonomous actually is in getting accurate packets of data, more so than investing in roadside technology. So those sorts of like traditional types of data, but also being really specific where junctions begin and end, where congestion's starting to build up, being really precise with those packets of data, I think is really key to unlocking autonomous there, and that's where we're investing. Confidence with sort of politicians. I mean, I think I would say, you know, government has legislated for, you know, carbon budgets are statutory. In transport, the transport decarbonisation plan, particularly the mandate for, you know, new vehicles being, you know, electric or you know, low emission vehicles for even for HGVs has been set out. So I think there is that longer term political context. What I would say is that what we also published last week alongside our plans for the next 5 years is our master plan. It's called Connecting the Country, and that looks over a series of decades, and we've used that as a basis for then thinking about the plans for today. So trying to sort of recognise that short-termism perhaps from a political side, but making sure our advice has that longer-term view. In terms of mass transit and things, particularly in rural areas, we do actually work with a lot of local authorities, particularly things like Bristol, looking at the M32 and possible sort of bus routes and park and rides and that sort of thing into the city centre. I think the other area where we do want to do work with people like LiftShare, Sustrans and so on, actually how can we increase vehicle occupancy? So I realise it's not mass transit, but if obviously we can get more people into the vehicles, I think currently running at something like 1.2 people per vehicle on the network. If we can increase that, again, we're making the most of the network. So again, lots of little things that will make a big difference, I think.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Well, that is unfortunately all we have time for. I could have carried on for a lot longer in terms of chatting all this through in the different topics. But first of all, can I just say thank you for all the questions and thoughts, but a really big thank you to our panel, to Adam, Kate and Christoph, who've provided their time and some fascinating insights as well. And if you'll join me in giving them a round of applause.
Right.
And right, I think that's it. So I'll hand over. Thank you very much.